are affecting a lot of land. I think it's also important to recognize that it's a multiple benefits issue when we fix it, but it's a multiple harm when we don't. And land is, it's not about climate change, biodiversity, and land. Land is sort of underneath these in the sense that if it's healthy, we can mitigate climate change, we can conserve biodiversity, we can alleviate poverty, and if it's not, we won't. I think it's also important to recognize that land is limited, and almost everything that we've done in the past has been geared towards what we do in place. What is the decision we're making on this piece of land? But we're not keeping up with the problem in that approach. We're not being holistic. We're not recognizing that land is limited, and therefore optimizing our decisions is the key to achieving these multiple benefits. And I think it's very clear what these multiple benefits are. They touch on all 17 SDGs. So do the trade-offs, and therefore so does the competition for land. So how do we navigate this? How do we keep land in balance? Well, we can't do it the old way. The old way was to go out and fix land degradation where we saw it and try to prevent it where it wasn't occurring through conservation. But that approach is never going to be successful because we're not considering the entire ecosystem. We're certainly not considering the entire country. And therefore, there can be trends that overwhelm, or what we say in the field, we end up with a lot of donut holes where the middle is a great sustainable land management project or restoration, and everything around it continues to degrade. So we need a balanced approach, and land degradation neutrality, which is a no net loss approach, provides us that possibility. It basically says we should not have further harm in net terms for each land type, each ecosystem type from today. And today was essentially 2015 and the SDG process. So we're not looking at land degradation per se, we're looking at this balance of where we see opportunities for restoring previously degraded land, where we can conserve and protect land, and where we can implement more sustainable practices in land that's already been converted, particularly for agriculture, but for any purposes. So the mechanism for neutrality, as I mentioned, is this in this no net loss approach is something that we call counterbalancing. In this convention, we don't apply any terminology, or we try to avoid terminology which has political baggage, because everything is voluntary when it comes to the UNCCD. If we use the word, which is correct, offsetting, people think of carbon offsets, biodiversity offsets, but this is at a national level. It would be a good complaint if we had the types of problems that we're talking about in those other environments, because it would mean a country is doing so much work that they're actually manipulating where they do what relative to other areas. We're nowhere close to that problem. So counterbalancing is a fair term. It's an accounting process rather than a choice in the mix. But it means, and this is where this group is really important, it means that we have to have the right information. And it's not just the right information, but it's applying that so that we can do the right things in the right places at the right scale. That's the simple way to define land degradation neutrality. And so everything that you're talking about in this meeting is of vital importance, and not simply at the national to global level, as I'm going to talk to you about in a moment, but more importantly at the national to local level. So the integrated land use planning part of this is key. Most of our attention has been on land management, but now a lot more focus in the biodiversity world is called spatial planning, all the same thing. It's about integrating social, economic, and environmental demands for land so that we can optimize what we do. Where should we grow food? Where should we do the climate change mitigation projects, et cetera. In the counterbalancing, we are looking at gains and losses, anticipated gains and losses in the planning process, where we make a decision about all aspects of land for an entire country, and then decide this is where the best use of our resources are for our interventions. And then we have a response hierarchy of avoid, reduce, and reverse land degradation that I already went through just a moment ago, where prevention is better than cure. It's a lot easier, a lot cheaper, and much more effective to avoid degradation than it is to fix something that is degraded. But the reality is this isn't a choice per parcel of land. You really only have one option. If it's not degraded, you're going to conserve it. If it's already farmed, you're going to put in better practices. If it's neither of those, it's already been harmed, then we're going to use ecological rehabilitation and restoration practices. And we have to recognize that the solutions vary location to location because the drivers vary. Everything is different. So as the IPCC demonstrated, there are a lot of very well proven approaches, and ideally we should be mixing these so that we end up, for example, with a biophysical intervention that may help us with the landscape, but at the same time, value chains, sustainable value chains. So the livelihoods of those local communities are benefited through the restoration. This is something that can come from the urban center all the way to natural areas. All of it is in play in land degradation neutrality, and it can be zoomed in, right? We're talking about options that vary in a watershed, not just across an entire country. Governance is key. If we don't have clear, effective, and responsible governance, safeguarded land tenure, integrated land use planning that's transparent, that's the link between the policies and the actions on the ground, et cetera, we will not succeed in this process. We also have to recognize that for land degradation neutrality, monitoring is about learning. It's not about who's doing better than who. It's not about a punitive response if something fails. It's about more information when it's available to make course corrections so we can actually achieve the goal of land degradation neutrality by 2030 or better. And then all of this is packaged inside of SDG target 15.3 and its indicator proportion of land that is degraded over total land area. You might be aware that the parties of the UNCCD for the second time have reported on this indicator and its sub-indicators. Those sub-indicators were selected on the basis of their relevance across all the ecosystem services that are flowing from land. And they cover pretty well, but a country can add additional indicators, either by location or in a broader sense, to be more comprehensive, because of course, 3 simple indicators doesn't cover all the dimensions of land degradation, but it does cover the dimensions that are most likely interesting and useful in every part of the world. It also, these indicators have been shaped to include a transformational variable, which is land cover change, the trends in land cover change, land productivity dynamics. Land productivity is the primary indicator everyone uses to look at land degradation, but it's also the most influenced by, for example, changes in the weather. So we have to be careful about that fastness of this ecological variable. And then the holy grail, the one that's coming up in this meeting, which is soil organic carbon. It's by far and away the most important indicator for understanding land degradation. It is correlated with erosion and many other processes in the landscape. In other words, if it's not there, we're in trouble, basically. But it's really, really hard to measure. So it's a challenge. It's useful, but not easy to incorporate in the process. So with that, I will only touch in a little more detail on the monitoring of soil organic carbon. It's a process right now that's tied to the IPCC tiered approach. And the emphasis here is a recognition that not every country has the networks of soil monitoring dense enough to provide tier 3 level information. But that's where we need to be moving towards. We need to be expanding these networks and increasing this. And certainly at the national to local level, it's indispensable. These get integrated to create SDG indicator 15.3.1. It's called one out, all out. It basically means you have to be at least stable in all 3 indicators for stability. If one of them is degrading, then it doesn't matter whether the other 2 are doing well. It is considered degraded in that location. All of this is part of the SDG process for tiers. We're now a tier 1 indicator, meaning that the guidance is got global standards. Many of you actually contributed to the process of identifying those standards and incorporating them into this good practice guidance. So the last part of the chat has to do with data, tools, and guidance for monitoring and reporting. And if what you're doing is not already part of the group on Earth observations, it should be, because this is the intergovernmental and interorganizational mechanism that allows all data providers to contribute, all analytical tool developers to contribute in an interoperable way so that everybody can play and everyone gains in terms of the countries that would take advantage of the information that you're producing. If you're not linked to this, I strongly encourage you to embrace it. It's really a powerful mechanism, and it's central to our success in the UNCCD. It also applies, as I mentioned, to tools, although this is a younger part of the effort. The data part is now 5-6 years. We've been working on that side. The tool development in the last few years has really moved forward. Think of it as APIs that work across these tools so they all can plug into each other and take advantage of the information that the others may be contributing to the process. And with that, I thank you very much, and I pass it back to the organizers.